Hello and welcome back, everybody. Today we are going to be looking at the phenomenal sequel to by far the most popular review on this tiny little channel. That review was for The Three-Body Problem, and today we are going to be looking at The Dark Forest. Now, this isn't going to be a traditional full review. There is so much to talk about this book that I decided to split this up into two sections. This section is not going to dig into any spoilers. I won't mention anything that isn't already included in the jacket copy or in a synopsis that you would find on something like Goodreads. What this is going to ask is, should you read the second book if you enjoyed the first one? And if you should, what things might be different that you might want to keep in mind, because even though it is the sequel to The Three-Body Problem, I did find that this was a drastically different story and a drastically different book. Now, if you're watching this, in terms of spoilers, I am going to assume that you've already read The Three-Body Problem. So if you haven't read The Three-Body Problem, please go back, check that one out. It is definitely worth your time if you are at all interested in science fiction or Cixin Liu's work, or, I believe that this is going to be adapted for a TV show on Netflix, which is going to be really interesting to see how they pull that one off. But, this is going to assume that you've read the the first book. Now, I found this particularly interesting because I found that The Dark Forest has been several people's favorite installment of the series of the people who I've talked to, and a lot of people responded that way from my review of Three-Body Problem as well. My opinions on that are going to be fleshed out a little bit more in the second video. So I'm going to talk about three major things that you should probably keep in mind. Now, if you have read The Dark Forest and you think I am way out to lunch on this stuff, please let me know in the comments. And also, if I'm missing anything that you think people should be keeping in mind for this for the sequel, again, please include that in the comments. And do me the favor and avoid the spoilers as much as possible, because we do not want to ruin this for other people, because there is stuff to be ruined, right? There are reveals in this that are very satisfying that you don't want to take away from a reader. So without further ado, we're going to get into the first one. And the first one is the least important in my opinion, but it is something to keep in mind. So Three-Body Problem was written in a kind of standard chapter format, right? The chapters don't vary a crazy amount in length between one another. Chapter breaks usually include a change of character viewpoint or maybe a change of scenery or anything like that. And it's something that we're all familiar and used to. Now, that doesn't happen in The Dark Forest. In The Dark Forest, instead of kind of the standard chapter format, what you're going to get is you're going to get a few sections, right? Just like in The Three-Body Problem, it's split up into big chunks throughout the novel. However, within those, instead of doing chapters, it breaks it down by the year of the Trisolaran crisis. Now, each year of the Trisolaran crisis has quite a bit that happens in between. Some years more than others. But if you're going to change character viewpoint, you're not going to get that in a chapter break. You're going to get it in a line break. If you have a scene break, again, that's just going to be a line break instead of a chapter break. So you're going to be met with a little bit more of a wall of text before you get kind of that ease or break in the pacing of the writing. Now, again, this isn't a huge issue for a lot of people. When I think about stuff like this, I think about the two extremes. I think about something like James Patterson. Now, I have never actually read a James Patterson novel, but I do recall picking one up. I think it was like in a grocery store or something like that, and just leafing through it and noticing that the chapters were only like 2 or 3 pages long. It was very staccato, very quick, right? The cadence was like very snappy, like it really carried you along, and I'm guessing that's by design to be devoured rather quickly, which is probably one of the reasons why he's very popular. But you could take something like this and contrast that with somebody like José Saramago, which is, as far as I'm aware, Jose and not Jose, because he's Portuguese and not Spanish. But José Saramago is a Nobel Prize winner. He has one of my favorite books, which is Blindness, but it is a very difficult book to read. Most of his books are difficult to read because he doesn't really have paragraphs. His average paragraph length is like a page and a half. It's big walls and chunks of text, also probably by design to kind of suck you into really getting stuck within the, I guess, the shape of what he's trying to create with his narrative. But that can put a lot of readers off, and it had me put down his books in the past. Now, I'm not saying that The Dark Forest is that aggressive with the big walls of text. The standard formatting elsewhere is going to be the same, chapter breaks, line breaks. There is punctuation, unlike José Saramago. But it is just something to keep in mind. The next thing, my second topic, is kind of to ask ourselves, is this a true sequel? And the short answer is yes. Obviously, we're following the events of the first one. But what I mean by this is I'm not somebody who reads a lot of series, and I actually finished my first ever series, which was just a trilogy really last year. Not that I haven't read sequels, I've read many sequels, but I tend to get very bored if if the same thing is strung along for too long. But in a typical sequel or series, what you tend to do is follow a similar cast of characters, right? Some characters might come in, some might leave. If you don't have to have read a series to understand this. If you've watched Game of Thrones, you understand what I'm talking about from season to season. But you still have a generally same cast of characters as the conflict that they're dealing with is evolving through time. That doesn't happen here. In the Dark Forest, you're going to deal with pretty much a completely different set of characters. And I'm not going to spoil anything by telling you whether that's due to events that happened in the book or not. I don't really think that's relevant. What is relevant is that I found it interesting that what we're dealing with here is less following the individual characters than following the overarching conflict and Trisolaran crisis in general, and how that addresses the questions and deals with different aspects of the narrative from the first book to the second book. Now, in my review for the three-body problem, I did mention that you might not fall in love with the characters, which is not the same as saying there was poor characterization. I thought the characterization was actually very well done. There's this thing called petting the dog. Petting the dog is a mechanism that writers will use to get you to sympathize with the character. So they will either show the character doing something that will make you like them, or they will put the character in pain, and that way you can create some sort of connection or empathy with the character that will connect you to the story so you can follow along. And this happens very strongly in the three-body problem right in the beginning. However, a lot of characters don't have that, and I don't find that very much in the Dark Forest. But that's not a big issue for this series, in my opinion, because I don't think that's the crux of what makes this series special. What makes this series special are the plot mechanisms, context, questions, and execution that Cixin Liu brings to these books. And the third thing to keep in mind, guys, and this is the biggest thing for me, if there's a reason why I didn't like the Dark Forest so much as three-body problem, and again, I'll get to this in more detail in my next review, it's because of this. When I reviewed the three-body problem, one of my favorite things about it was the cultural context in which it happened. The character motivations stemmed from real-life events that I am very interested in. It was the Chinese Revolution, it was the Cultural Revolution in China. And this is a topic that I have taken particular interest in. My interest in this stuff stems initially from reading the Gulag Archipelago, and then made me want to dig into more of the atrocities of the 20th century, and that made me pick up books like, one sec. Books like this, for instance, which was a very difficult read, and I didn't make it all the way through it. It's a very dense, very long read, but it gives you a strong cultural idea of where some of the three-body problem comes from. And the way that Cixin Liu was able to weave that into a broader science fiction story is what captivated me so much. Some of my favorite scenes of three-body problem actually had nothing to do with the science fiction aspect of it at all. The intro to three-body problem immediately drew me in. Rarely have I felt stronger during an introduction of a book than I did during Three-Body Problem. And one of my favorite scenes from Three-Body Problem was when Wenjie later on confronts the women who beat her father to death, and they actually come back at her and say, look, do you think we were victimless in this entire thing as well? We suffered our own consequences for taking part. How dare you think that you're the only one that was hurt by this? And I thought that it just add that one extra layer of literary analysis to this already rich book that had dealt with so much, from scientific concepts to cultural relevance to historical aspects, that tied everything together in a phenomenal piece of fiction. In The Dark Forest, I just don't get that. The Dark Forest seems to be a little bit more of a conventional science fiction novel where we already have all those things set up, so the argument can be made that maybe it's not so necessary in this book because we have already laid the foundation for that, and now we're moving on to different questions. And that is valid, and that's fair, and that's completely fine, and if that's what you prefer, that's what you prefer, but you should know that that is different from the Three-Body Problem, and for me, it was a very distinct difference in feeling when I read this book versus Three-Body Problem. Now, I'm not going to say that that's completely absent from this, but I can't give that away or hint at what that might be without completely spoiling the book. Not completely spoiling the book. We will talk about that in the next review, but this is just something that if that was what you loved about Three Body Problem, I'm not going to say that you won't love the Dark Forest. I'm just going to tell you that it's not as prevalent within this story. Those are the main things that I found that were different between the first and the second book. So if you were to ask me, is the second book worth reading? Absolutely yes. There were parts that, I mean, in Three Body Problem, people said that the pacing was a little bit slow, particularly in uncovering what the whole game of Three Body Problem was like, but I actually kind of like those puzzles. I like those kind of Borgesian conundrums that you can throw people in. If you're not familiar with Borges, very dense, genius short story writer from the early 20th century, I believe. And Cixin Liu takes plot devices like that from the first one and he alters them in the second one in the form of the Wall Facer project, which you can read again in the blurb. Again, this is nothing that you won't know if you haven't read Three Body Problem, but you know, now that the Trisolarans have blocked all human progress on Earth using the Sophons, humans need a way to get around that, and the only thing that those Sophons can't read is the human mind. So they have assigned a certain amount of individuals to the Wall Facer project, and these people basically have unlimited resources at their disposal to dream up a way to beat the Trisolarans in a way that the Trisolarans can't predict. And the fun part of this book is that the ETO, headed by Wenjie in the first book, assigns wall breakers who are responsible for uncovering those plans so that they can inform them, publish them to the Trisolarans, and basically ruin Earth's chances of defense. Now, the Wall Facer project is basically to Dark Forest what the Three Body Problem game was to the Three Body Problem, and it had its own pacing issues in my opinion, but it's equally enriching in its own way. Again, the only thing that I would take away from this, and this is very much a personal preference, is just the lack of the cultural context that grounded me so strongly in the first book. And because if you are going to create a completely speculative environment that you're going to thrust the reader into, that is completely fine. I am 100% there for it. But if you can ground that in real events and real people and real conflicts that we are dealing with day to day as humans, that for me wins every single time. And that is why I guess I would probably get scoffed at by a lot of traditional science fiction fans and people in the fandom, because I'm somebody who will gravitate more towards something like Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles than I will to, I guess, a typical space opera kind of science fiction that is completely generated out of imagination without that grounding in the human conflicts that we deal with day to day. And again, it's not that you can't extrapolate those into these newly realized worlds. It's just I personally like being grounded in a little bit more of reality. Now, does that make this less than a phenomenal book? No. It's just something to keep in mind. Now, if you've read the whole series, don't say anything about Death's End, because I've just started Death's End. I actually started it as an audiobook, and I'm kind of regretting that immediately because it's not narrated that well in my opinion. Oh, and the last thing that I want to bring up, and I think this is actually super important, the first and third book in the series are translated by Ken Liu. Now, Ken Liu is also a writer. He wrote Paper Menagerie and Other Stories, which is one of my all-time favorite short story collections. It's one of my favorite audiobooks. I think he's a phenomenal writer. I haven't read any of his novels, but The Dark Forest is the only one that's narrated by Joel Martinson, and I've heard complaints from them. So if you are a Chinese speaker, I would love to hear your opinion on the difference in narration, in translation, particularly if you've read both versions. Is there stuff that he misses? Are there things that he's not grabbing or not translating correctly? I've read places that there are aspects of the Wall Facer project that incorporate ball lightning into this, and Cixin Liu has a book called Ball Lightning that is completely absent in the English version, and I'm not sure why they may or may not have made that choice. So if you could add a little bit of perspective to that, I would love to hear it in the comments. So yeah, guys, those are the main things. I guess it was 4 things if you include the translation, but those are just 4 things to keep in mind if you're going to go into The Dark Forest. It doesn't mean you should not read it. I would consider them both 5 out of 5 books just because of how masterfully they're put together. But as a personal preference, this one didn't hit me as hard while I was reading it, but it did keep me thinking about the themes and concepts and ideas for equally long long after the three-body problem once I was done reading it, which for me is a hallmark of a great book. So I am super stoked to dive into Death's End. There are a few books I want to get through first, just because I need to cleanse my palate of the hard sci-fi a little bit, so I can truly enjoy Death's End when I do tackle it, but it will be on the horizon. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you guys on the next review. Os.